Let us learn though on that note. So today's daf in Masechet Zevachim near the end of the 13th parak is Kuf Yud Aleph 111, and we are I don't know where you got to, Miriam, but we are going to start from 4 lines on the bottom of Kuf Yud Amud Bet. Tanu Rabbanan. You got past that, but
That's where,
it's
that's
okay.
where I stop.
Right. So we're going to start there. It's a good place to start, to be honest. So that's the discussion in our Mishnah, as you recall, yesterday, was about other things, right? Besides shchita and zrika and halab, bechutz, all these things which we've learned are chayev. What about if you do nisuch hamayim, right? So the Mishnah talked about nisuch hamayim on Sukkot. Usually in the Beit HaMikdash, you would pour wine. That was nisuch, nisachim. But once a year on the holiday of Sukkot, they would pour water on the Mizbeach, and that was an avoda. And we discussed yesterday Rabbi Akiva's opinion and maybe everyone's opinion that Nisuch HaMayim is Doraita or Halacha Moshe Sinai. So if you do something that's done bifnim outside, that's usually called avodat chutz, right? Shchitat chutz, halat chutz. Says the Gemara today, 4 lines on the bottom, Tanu Rabbanan. Come and learn. Says the Gemara, the Braita, Hamenasech shlosha lugim mayim bechag. Let's say you pour 3 lug of water out during the Chag, which is the shir of the Chag, and you do it b'chutz, right? You do it outside the Beit HaMikdash. Instead of doing it on the Mizbeach where you're supposed to, you do it outside. Says the Braita Chayav, you're Chayav for avodat chutz. And Rabbi Shimon Omer, take out the Rabbi Lazar, sorry, take out the Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Lazar Omer, well, it depends. Im mal'an l'shem chag chayav. If you filled up the water in order to fulfill the mitzvah of the Chag and put it on the Mizbeach, and instead of putting it on the Mizbeach, you took it outside, then you're chayav. Now, my Benayu asked the Gemara, or as Rashi seems to have a girsa of what's it? Rashi quotes the words b'mai kamifligi, right? It's not clear whether he wants to change the girsa, which the Bach does, but what's the difference, right? What is Rabbi Shimon saying? What is Rabbi Eliezer saying that argues with the Tanakh? Says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, b'yesh shiur b'mayim kamifligi. Machloket between them is whether there is a amount of water that you have to use in order for it to be nisuch hamayim. Meaning, presumably, if you just take a cup of water and you pour it outside and say, I'm doing this for the Chag, you're not chayiv. It has to be the right amount to be done bifnim. And the question is there a right amount, right? Is there a set amount? The Tanakhama seems to imply there isn't really. As long as you take 3 lug and do that, which is the set amount, sorry, as long as you take 3 lug, you'd be chayiv. And Rebbe Lezer is coming and saying that, in fact, you don't even need to do that, right? You'd be chayiv even if you don't have 3 lug because, sorry, Rashi is the opposite. The Tanakhama says 3 lug or more than 3 lug, right? 3 lug is the minimum share you need for the Chag, but if you had 5, that's okay. And if you poured out 5 lug outside, you'd be chayiv. And comes along Rabbi Elazar to say, no, it has to be exactly the way you're supposed to do it by Beit HaMikdash, which is 3 lug and not more and not less. And so if you do 10 lug, you're patur. That's one explanation. Rav Papa says the machlok is actually a little bit deeper, a little bit more complex, maybe not deeper. The machlok at top of Daf Kuf Yud Aleph and Aleph now is whether karvu nisachim bamidbar kamifligi. They're arguing about a machlok which we've had many times before as to whether or not they brought nisachim bamidbar. Now, why does that matter for nisuch hamayim on Sukkot? So the reason it matters, Rashi explains it in detail here, is that everybody agrees that yesh shir l'mayim, that you have to have a specific amount. And the question is there a specific amount? And that depends on whether or not there's such a concept of nisachim, of anything, in the midbar. Why is that? We're going to see the Gemara in a little bit. But when the Torah comes along and talks in Parashat Shlach about nisachim, which is really out of nowhere, it's not really where we're talking about karbanot. It says, when you get to the land of Israel and you bring a karban, bring nisachim with the karban. It's talking about nisachim of wine, which is normal nisachim. So the question is, what is that referring to? So there's one opinion, and we've had this a few times, we're going to have it a few more, that what the Torah is coming to tell you there is that in the midbar, they didn't bring nisachim. You could bring karbanot in the midbar, in the Mishkan, but they didn't bring wine with those karbanot. When you get to Eretz Yisrael, it comes along the pasuk and says, bring nisachim when you bring a karban, but it's saying only when you come al Beit Eretz Moshvotichem until to the Beit Hamikdash, or say a big bama gedola, like Shiloh or something like that. But on a private bama, you would never bring nisachim. There's no such idea. In which case, if there's no such idea of nisachim, then basically what that means is that you don't ever do nisachim on a private bama. And in order to be chayav for doing something on a private bama, you'd have to have first put it inside the Beit HaMikdash in a kli sharet, made it kodesh, and then brought it outside. If you didn't do that and pour 3 lug without a kli sharet, without anything like that, you wouldn't be chayav on a private bama. The other opinion is that in fact there were nisachim in the midbar. So when the Torah gives this whole discussion and says, when you get to Eretz Yisrael, do nisachim, what is it teaching you? We already know you do nisachim. It's coming to teach you that even when you have a private bama, a backyard bama, do nisachim in Eretz Yisrael. Remember, because in the midbar they didn't have a private bama. The thing is, we're going to see in tomorrow's Mishnah, if you stick around for the recording, is that in a private bama, there was no such thing as a kli sharet. You never had a special kli. A private bama didn't have a kohen, didn't have a kli sharet. So clearly, if you do nisachim in a private bama, you don't need a kli sharet for nisachim. And so then, even if you don't put the water, the right amount in a kli sharet, and you pour it outside of the chag, you'd be chayav because you have included pouring nisachim even without a kli sharet. So that's the machloket between the Tanna Kama and Rebbe Elazar, whether or not nisachim apply, which means does a kli sharet apply or not apply. So that is the second explanation. The third explanation is Ravina, and Ravina says, I agree with you, Rav Papa. It really has to do with this complicated machloket about whether there are nisachim in the midbar. But the issue is not so much whether there are nisachim; it's whether the nisachim of nisuch hayayin, which is the red wine, which is the typical one, is the same thing as nisuch hamayim, which is the one on Pesach, on Sukkot. Meaning, the question is, it's clear that there's a machloket whether nisuch hayayin happened in the midbar or not, and therefore whether or not you need a kli sharet for nisachim. If it happened in the desert, it's not in the desert. If it happened in the desert, that means that it also happens in a bamat yachid, and you don't need a kli sharet. If it didn't happen in the desert, it means it doesn't happen on bamat yachid, and you need a kli sharet. The question is, does the same rule apply to nisuch hayayin? That the same rule learned from nisuch hayayin to nisuch hamayim, and that's the machloket. Okay, so let's read that inside. Ravina says, "B'lameidin nisuch hamayim and nisuch hayayin kamifligin." That's the machloket. So that is the 3 ways to understand that machloket. Says the Gemara now at the second end of the second line, Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Tanu Rabbanan. Says the Braita, "Haminasech shloshe lugin yayin b'chutz." Right. So this, unlike the first Braita today, which talked about water, this one gets straight to the question of wine, which is the question that we said was a little simpler. So you take 3 lug of yayin, you pour it outside on your private altar. Says the Braita chayav. That's avodah that's supposed to be done in the Beit HaMikdash. You did it outside. You're chayav for shchutei chutz. Reb Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Here's where Reb Elazar, Rabbi Shimon shows up and says, "Well, it's only true if you put it in a kli sharet. Hu shekichan b'kli. It's only if you put it in a kli sharet before you poured it out." Says my benai. What's the difference between them? So says Rav Ada bar Rav Yitzchak, well, the difference has nothing to do really with what we've been talking about. It has to do with this concept called Berutzei Midot Iko Beinayo. Berutzei Midot is a concept, I don't know how they translate it in English, but you might have an English mirror, but basically Berutzei Midot refers to the overflow of a cup, right? So remember, we all know, I don't remember all the words for it, but if you put liquid in a cup, it has surface tension, and it can go above the top of the cup. Right, so you could have a 10-liter cup, and you could put 10.5 liters of liquid into it. Let's say.
Translated says overfill.
Right. Okay, that sounds like a simple word. I'm not sure where the word berutze means, but basically, you could obviously do this with flour. It's very easy, but it happens with liquid too. Meaning, you could have a 3-gallon container for flour and put 3.5 gallons in it, or whatever measurement you use, because it just overflows. Right. So the question is between them is that overflowing considered to be part of the kli sharet? Right? One interpretation, and this is a big machloket we've had many times, or will have many times, is to, when we say something has to be inside a kli sharet, does that mean it has to be physically within the kli sharet? And if it's overflowing the top, it's not holy? Or does it have to be contained by the kli sharet? And basically the container holds it, that's enough. So that's the machloket. Nothing to do really with details, just the question of, is that considered to be kli sharet or not kli sharet? Okay, that's one answer. Says Rava Breder Rabba, 5 lines on the 6 lines on the top. The question really is what we just talked about. Amru kervu nesachim babama ikabenaro. The whole question between them is there a concept of nesachim in a bama? And again, the reason why that matters, God bless you, is that if there's a nesachim on a bama, the principle, again, which we're going to have tomorrow, is that there was no kli sharet on a bama. So if you hold that you do nisachim on a bama, it means you don't need to put your nisachim in a kli sharet, right? So then, even if you didn't put it in a kli sharet in the Beit HaMikdash and you brought it outside, you'd be chayav. But if you hold that you do not bring nisachim on a bama, it's because you need a kli sharet for nisachim. In which case, if you take your nisachim from inside and pour them outside, you're only chayiv if they were first in the kli sharet. Okay? So let's read that inside. So the nisachim bebama ika beinayo, ubeplukta dahani tnai. It's actually the machloket of the following tanaim. Which are these following tanaim? The Tanya. And this is, again, it's the same machloket over and over, but there's different versions of it. Says the Braita, bamat yachid einot tzricha nisachim divrei Rabbi. Says Rabbi, there is no need to bring nisachim on a bamat yachid. If a person says, I'm going to bring a carbon ola on my backyard bama, which you're allowed to do, we're going to get into it tomorrow, then you do not bring nisachim with that carbon. And again, that therefore means that if you do want to do nisachim, that from the Beit HaMikdash outside, it has to be first put in a kli sharet. But Chachamim omrim, no, to not nisachim. That in fact, a private karban on a private bama does need nisachim, right? And you don't have a kli sharet. So it means you don't need a kli sharet for your nisachim. In fact, there's another opinion in the Braita which mirrors the same machloket, and this one actually quotes the psukim, the Tanya, as the Braita said, and this is a pasuk in Shlach. It says, "Ki tavo." You have the whole pasuk though, right?
Yeah.
It's getting out. It's great psukim. It says, "Dabrel b'nei Yisrael matalim ki tavo eretz moshvotechem asher ani noten lachem." When you get to the land, right, and then it continues and says, "Do nisachim." So what is that teaching you? Says the Braita. When you get there, ki tavo hatina nisachim bebama gedola katuv medaber. The Torah is coming to tell you that you have to do nisachim on a bama gedola, right? Not a private bama, but like Nov and Givon or Shiloh, let's say, right? The big bamot. Says the Braita, Ata Omer b'bama gedola, you know, b'bama ketana. How do you know? Why do you assume that this is referring to a bama gedola? Maybe it's referring to a bama ketana, meaning a private bama. Because when it continues and says, and I read the words, El Eretz Moshvotechem, right, to the land that you're going to inherit, Asher Ani Noten Lachem. So then it's basically saying we're referring to a place, Harei B'Bama Noheget L'Kulchem HaKatuv Medaber. The Torah is clearly referring to a bama which you can all go to, meaning a bama gedola, like Shiloh, but not someone's private bama. And so the Torah is clearly referring to, context-wise, when you get to Eretz Yisrael and you get to a place that everybody shares, then you bring nisachim. But in an individual bama, you don't bring nisachim. Divrei Rebbe Yishmael.
Or maybe the Mishkan in Gilgal for the first 14 years.
Right, I've been a little vague about this because that's the next Mishnah where we're going to talk about Gilgal.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't look ahead.
Well, no. I mean, it's not going to be so. The Mishnah, as like I told you, is a long Mishnah. It's tomorrow's Mishnah. But yeah, I'll agree with you. I can say the point, Charlie, which is a great and important and confusing point, which is that when they left, right, there were basically 5 stages in the Mishkan. Okay, the 5 stages where there was the Mishkan of Moshe, we'll call it, in the Midbar. Okay, everybody agrees, and we're going to, again, this is tomorrow's Mishnah, but I'm giving you the preview. Everybody agrees that in the Midbar, there was no sacrifice on private bamot. Okay, there was just the Mishkan. Walk to the Mishkan and do your karban. Now, whether there were private karbanot or not, we're going to discuss. The next stage was that they went into Eretz Yisrael, and as Charlie just mentioned, the Mishkan was set up in Gilgal, right? So that was considered to be a bama gedola, right? Everyone was able to go there, but it was not permanent. And we'll see this all in the next week. The next stage after Gilgal was called Shiloh. The bama went to Shiloh. Shiloh was semi-permanent. Everyone went to Shiloh. It stood in Shiloh for 369 years, I think is the number we're going to say. Very long time. After Shiloh was destroyed, that I'm calling the 3rd stage, there was the 4th stage, which is what we call Nov and Givon, which are really 2 places, but we always put them together, where the bama went to Nov and Givon. And what was interesting about Nov and Givon is that they didn't really have the mizbeah, the aron. So they had a mizbeah. They didn't have an aron, right? Because remember, when Shiloh was destroyed, was when the Plishtim captured the aron from the children of Eli, right? So the Mishkan was destroyed. They had a new Mishkan, but they didn't have the aron, and that is treated differently. So that's Nov and Givon, right? We all know that Nov, unfortunately, had a very difficult ending on the hands of Shaul, killed them all. All right, and then it moved to Givon. And then, of course, the 5th stage was the Beit HaMikdash, right, in David's time. So, or Shlomo's time. So anyways, we're going to get there. But right now, we're talking about Bama Gedola, assuming it means any of those things. That's Rabbi Shmuel's opinion. Says Rabbi Akiva, we are around 12 lines, I think, from the top, maybe 15. Rabbi Akiva says, you know how you read the pasuk in Shlach? You should read it the following way. Ki tavo'u el eretz moshvotechem. You should do nisachim. What that's telling you is, the The Torah is coming to say when you get into Eretz Yisrael and during the time of Gilgal, and you have a private bama, you don't feel like going to Gilgal, you can't get there, you should bring nisachim, bring libations with your korban at home, right? Ask the Braita, how do you know that? Ata omer lebama ktana, o eino ela bama gedola. How do you know this pasuk is referring to a private bama? Maybe it's a public bama. Says Rabbi Akiva, Kashu Omer, because it continues and says, El Eretz Moshvotechem, to the land that you inherit. You know what I learned from there? Hare b'bama noheget b'chol moshevet hakatuv medaber. It has to be in a bama that can be anywhere you live. It's not constrained by geography. It's anywhere you go. Now, obviously, the bama gedolah was in one place, Shiloh or Gilgal or where Yerushalayim eventually, but the bama ketana is anywhere you live. So when the Torah says b'chol eretz moshvotechem, it means anywhere you live, you bring a nisachim on your korban. Okay. So therefore, says the Gemara, just to connect everything we learned so far today, Kishetimsa Lomar, turns out the way you understand this Braita is the Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, who says that when it says Dunis Sachim in the Eretz Yisrael, it means in a Bama Gedolah, then Lo Karvu Nisachim Bamidbar. They didn't bring Nisachim in the desert. And so the Torah is coming to introduce and say, but when you get to Israel, do Nisachim, right? But not on a private Bama. Then Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Karvu Nisachim Bamidbar. According to Rabbi Akiva, they were already doing nisachim in the midbar. And the Torah is here coming to tell you, but when you get into Eretz Yisrael and you have the option for a private bama, bring nisachim on your private bama. So that's the machloket. It started with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. It went down to Rebbe and to argue with Rebbe and the Tanakama, I think it was. Yep, Rebbe and the Chachamim. And then we had, another opinion of our Mishnah, Rebbe Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, and the Tanakama. So all of them argued in the same thing. Okay, we're up to the two dots now, almost more than halfway down. Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, and Rabbi Nechemia, Rabbi Nechemia said the opinion in our Mishnah, which seemed like a very interesting opinion, which is that, remember, if you take blood from the Beit HaMikdash and you sprinkle it outside the Beit HaMikdash on a bama, on an altar, you're chayav for halat chutz, right, or zrikat chutz. What if you take the shirayim, so you sprinkle the blood on the mizbeach, the leftover blood of the karban chatat, what are you supposed to do with it?
Pour it in the drains.
You pour it in the yesod, on the base of the mizbeach, right? But instead of pouring it on the base of the mizbeach, you took it outside and poured it on an altar. Are you chayiv for that or not? So Rabbi Nechemia said in the Mishnah, you're chayiv. Shiyari adam shekrivo b'chutz chayav. That was Rabbi Nechemia in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, says Rabbi Yochanan. Let me explain to you Rabbi Nechemia's rationale. Tana, I learned or taught Rabbi Nechemia kedivrei ha'omer shirayim ma'akvim. Rabbi Nechemia is of the opinion, this is a machlokah we had earlier in the Masechta, you could see several times earlier, but we had it in Ezim Mekomam, our famous parak, that there's a machlokah about whether shirayim or ma'akfim. Let's say, remember with the dam chatat, you're supposed to put four parts of the mizbeach, right, each corner. And no, four that are four, right? And then you spill the shirayim on the mizbeach. There was an opinion earlier that if you lose the blood before you pour it on the yisod, you didn't do the carbon, you don't get a kapara. And that is the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia, that you have to pour the blood on the yisod. If you don't, you didn't do the karban. And therefore, since you didn't finish doing the karban, if you take it outside and sprinkle it, you're chayav. Okay, that's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Says the Gemara, how could that be true? Meitve, ask the Gemara. The Braita says the following. Now we're quoting a Braita. Rabbi Nechemia Omer, which is what he said in our Mishnah, Shiyari Adam Shekivam B'chutz chayav. Right? Rabbi Nechemia said, if you bring the leftover of the blood of a chatas outside the Beit HaMikdash, you're chayav for halat chutz. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, now this is not in our Mishnah. Now Rabbi Akiva in the Braita challenges Rabbi Nechemia. He says, what do you mean? Halo shiyari adam are shiyari mitzvahim. What's the big deal? The leftover blood are leftover from a mitzvah. They're not essential. So what's the big deal of sprinkling them outside? Okay? That's what Rabbi Akiva said. Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Nechemia should have responded and said, what do you mean they're leftover for a mitzvah? They're essential for the mitzvah. But that's not what Rabbi Nechemia says. What Rabbi Nechemia says is, Amar lo, he says back to him, well, who cares if it's not essential? Ivarimu pedarim yochicho. What about the limbs of an animal, right? Remember, if you use reek of an animal and then all the meat gets thrown out, you still get a kapara. You don't have to burn the meat on the mizbeach. You have to use reek on the mizbeach. But the halacha of halat chutz means if you take the animal's parts and you burn them on the mizbeach outside, you're chayav. That's the definition of halat chutz. So you clearly see, says Rabbi Nechemia, that it doesn't need to be essential to be chayav. It's a good answer. But the point according to Rabbi Yochanan is that's the wrong answer. Because the answer should have been, it is essential. But anyways, that's Rabbi Nechemiah's answer. Amar lo, Ivarim P'tarim Yochicha Shehem Shiarei Mitzvah. They are leftovers, meaning they're not essential, they're extra for a mitzvah. But you're still chayav if you do them outside. Amar lo, Rabbi Akiva said back to Rabbi Nechemiah, don't ask me questions from the parts of the animal. Lo im amar be'varim u'pedarim sheim tchilat avodah. That's the beginning of burning the animal. So it's not essential, but it's important. Tomar b'shiarei adam she'ein tchilat avodah. The leftover blood is both not essential and it's the remainder of the avodah. Okay, so anyways, that's the machloket in the Braita. Says the Gemara, this is a big problem for Rabbi Yochanan, because in Ita, Rabbi Yochanan is correct. The Rabbi Nechemiah's rationale is that you're chayav because it's essential. So why do you say that to him? Lei malei. Why didn't Rabbi Nechemiah say back to Rabbi Akiva, Hani nami ma'akfi, right? That you have to put the blood on the mizbeh. The blood's chayav because it also is essential. So tiyufta, clearly Rabbi Yochanan is wrong. Now, don't get too upset with Rabbi Yochanan, because in a few minutes we're going to come back and say that he's right. But right now we think he's wrong. Says the Gemara, but the truth is, Hashta Damar of Adabar Ava. Now that Reb Adabar Ava made a point that which no one has raised yet, which you guys should all remember from Ezu Mekoman, which is that, remember, there was an opinion in Ezu Mekoman in the earlier parak that the Shiarei Adam is Ma'akiv. But Reb Adabar Ava told us earlier that don't make any mistakes of thinking that means all dam. It only means Shiraim of a Chatat Hapnim, like a Paralam Davar Shel Tzibor or a Parei Ida, but not a regular karban chatat that's done outside. No one thinks that's ma'akiv. So it says, let me read inside. Hashadamar v'adabar ava machloket b'shiraim hapnimiyim. The only machloket whether shiraim or ma'akiv is about the karbanot that are done inside the kodesh, right, on the mizbeach on the inside. Aval b'shiraim achitzonim divrei hakol lo ma'akvi. When you come now to the avodah of chutz, everybody agrees that the shiraim are not ma'akiv. So a karban chatat, the shiraim are definitely not ma'akev. So now, how does Rabbi Nechemiah make any sense? Says the word Kik Amar Rabbi Nechemiah b'shiraim hapnimiyim. So clearly, Rabbi Nechemiah in our Mishnah, who said you are chayav, is talking about when you have shiraim of a karban chatat that was done inside, like a parallel davar shel tzibor. But the Braita where Rabbi Nechemiah is arguing with Rabbi Akiva and doesn't say that, is talking about a regular karban chatat where the shiraim are not ma'akev. Ki tanya hi b'shiraim hachitzonim. And now I'm taking out the next lines because for some reason we take them out. But the point of the Gemara is, so then why did Rabbi Nechemiah say that to Rabbi Akiva? Why did Rabbi Nechemiah say to Rabbi Akiva, why are you giving me a hard time? You're saying it's extra. And I'm saying, well, so what if it's extra? So is the meat that you put on the Mizbeach. Just say to Rabbi Akiva, I'm not talking about the blood that's extra. I'm talking about a different blood. Says the Gemara because the Dvarav, the Rabbi Akiva Kamar is saying, according to your logic, right, which we do all the time. Look, I, Rabbi Nechemiah, am only really saying that extra blood from a chatat hapnim that you sprinkle outside is chayav. You, Rabbi Akiva, didn't understand me. You thought I meant all blood. And so you came to me and you said, well, what about the fact that it's not essential? So instead of me saying to you, I was only talking about essential blood, I say, well, I don't care, Rabbi Akiva. So what if it's not essential? The blood, the meat is also not essential. And Rabbi Akiva answered and said, well, the meat's the beginning, and this is not the beginning. So at the end of the day, it turns out that Rabbi Yochanan is correct. And that in fact, the reason Rabbi Nechemiah says that shirayim of the blood is ma'akev, is chayav b'chutz, is because it's ma'akev. And he's only referring to shirayim of a karban that's done bifnim. Okay, that is the end of that Mishnah. The next Mishnah, now 2 lines from the bottom of Kuf Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, is a complicated Mishnah and deals with the next question, which is birds. We always get confused when we get to birds, because the problem with birds, of course, which we've had this before as well, is that in the Beit HaMikdash, the way you kill a bird for a karban is through malika, right? Outside the Beit HaMikdash, the way you kill a bird is with shchita. And if you switch, they're puzzle, right? You can't do malika outside, you can't do shchita inside. So the question then becomes, you do shchita or malika inside, and you take the bird and burn it on Mizbeach outside, is it the inside or the outside that matters? So it's a beautiful topic for a Mishnah. Says our Mishnah now, 2 lines from the bottom. Hamolek et ha'of bifnim. You take a bird that's a karban, and you do malika properly. And now instead of putting it on the mizbeach or sprinkling the blood on the mizbeach, you take it outside and you do it outside. Ve'ha'la b'chutz, and you do the avodah outside. Chayav. So then you're chayav for avodah chutz because it's a proper karban done inside, and you took it outside. But the opposite way, if you're malak b'chutz, if you do malika outside of a karban, and then even if you're ha'la b'chutz, you're putter, because by doing malika to the animal, you basically killed it. You didn't do a karban. You made it puzzle at the time you did malika, because malika is not a concept outside the Beit HaMikdash. So therefore, the ha'ala was ha'ala of a pasul carbon, and therefore you're patur. That's the first case. The next case is what about shchita? Let's say instead of doing malika of your bird, you do shchita, hashochet of bifnim, you do shchita of your bird inside the Beit HaMikdash, and then ha'ala b'chutz, and then you take it outside and put it on the mizbeach. You're also patur, because by doing shchita inside, you pass on the animal, because you're not supposed to do shchita, you're supposed to do malika. So you're patur in that case. And the fourth case, which is the flip side of that, was let's say you're shachat b'chutz, you take a carbon and you shecht it outside the Beit HaMikdash, and ha'ala b'chutz, then you're chayav, because shchita is the way you're supposed to kill a bird outside the Beit HaMikdash. And so you're chayav for the shchita, you're chayav for the ha'ala, you're chayav for both, right? When we talked about before, two separate isurim, okay?
Yeah, they don't stack.
They do stack, shchita and ha'ala stack. So you're chayav for both. Nimsa, turns out, says the Mishnah, derech hechshero bifnim pituro b'chutz. The way you make a bird kosher bifnim, which is malika, patters you from then doing it outside. Because if you do malika outside, you would be pater, only if you do malika inside. But derech hechshero mi b'chutz, the way to make it kosher outside, and we're ask in 1 second, what do you mean making it kosher? We're talking about making a puzzle outside, right? Because you're doing shchute chutz. The way you do shchute chutz outside, which is with shchita, potro mi bifnim would pater you if you did it inside. So that's the first part. That's the Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon says something which makes no sense right now, and the Gemara will have a lot of fun with this. Kol shechayavin alav b'chutz, chayavin al kiyotzi bo bifnim, right? Shehala b'chutz. Anything that you'd be chayav if you did it outside, which sounds like, let's say you shech the bird, shchita, and if you do that inside, right? I'm sorry, if you did it, I'll read this side again. Kol shechayavin alav b'chutz, anything you're chayav for doing it outside of Beit HaMikdash, chayavin al kiyotzi bo bifnim shehala b'chutz. You'd be chayav for doing that inside and then burning it outside, except chutz min hashochet bifnim and maleh b'chutz. Except for the case of doing shchita inside and taking the bird outside, and of course that's the only case that makes any sense. So the Gemara is going to ask how to interpret this in a minute, Rabbi Shimon. But before we get to Rabbi Shimon, says Gemara, when you say anything that machshers, that's machshir a bird outside, makes it chayav for halat chutz. What do you mean machshir? It doesn't make the bird kosher; it makes the bird puzzle, right? Hi hechshiro, asked the Gemara at the last narrow line. Giyuvohu. It makes you chayav for shchutei chutz. Says Gemara, you're right. That's what we mean by hechshiro. Tzanich giyuvo, meaning anything that accomplishes what you're trying to accomplish. In this case, what you're trying to accomplish is violating the mitzvah. But anything that accomplishes what you're trying to do ends up making it chayav for halat chutz. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. Then Rabbi Shimon said what Rabbi Shimon said, and asked the Gemara at the first wide line of Daf Kuf Yud Aleph Amabet, what in the world is Rabbi Shimon saying? Ahecha koi. What is Rabbi Shimon responding to when he says anything that if you did it outside and you'd be chayav, if you did it inside and then brought it outside, you'd also be chayav, except for shchita b'fnim and halal b'chutz. Okay, so ahecha koi. What is Rabbi Shimon referring to? So remember, our Mishnah had two different cases: one case of malika, one case of shchita. So it says the Gemara, let's go by process of elimination. Maybe Rabbi Shimon is referring to the first part of the Mishnah, which quoted, now we're quoting the Mishnah, Hamolek of bifnim. You take a carbon and you do inside the Beit HaMikdash and you do malika, which is the proper thing to do. And then your ha'ala b'chutz, you're chayav. And you then take it outside and put it on an altar, you're chayav for halat chutz. But, continues the Mishnah, malak b'chutz, if you did the malika outside, that's not a kosher thing to do outside. So then if you're ha'ala b'chutz, you're patur. So that's the Tanakama. And along comes Rabbi Shimon to say, Rabbi Shimon says, no, they should have the same status inside and outside. Just like if you did malika inside and then burnt the animal outside, you'd be chayav. B'chutz nami b'chayav. If you do the malika outside, you're also chayav. So that's where he's arguing with the Tanakama, that although malika is normally only done bifnim, if you do it outside for this karban, you're also chayav for halah. That might be true. Whether it's true or not, we don't know. But it doesn't fit in the words of Rabbi Shimon, because then he should have said, third line, kol shechayavin alav b'chutz. Instead of saying, every time you're chayav outside, you're chayav inside, it's the opposite. Every time you're chayav inside, you're chayav outside. Should have said, kol shechayavin alav b'fnim, you're chayav outside mi b'ayle. Ella, clearly that's not what he's saying. Maybe what he's saying is the opposite. That you, Tanakama, said if you do malika inside, you're chayav, and then burn it outside. If you do a malika outside, you're pater. Maybe Rabbi Shimon is coming to say both are pater, right? That both are pater. Dibechutz lo mechayev. I agree with you, Tanakama, that if you do malika on a bird outside, you'd be patur for ha'ala. Bifnim nami lo lechayev. So you're also not chayev for doing it inside. So that might be what Rabbi Shimon's saying. But again, if Rabbi Shimon's trying to say that, what he should have said is, right, kol she'en chayav and love b'chutz mibayla. He should have said, anything you're not chayav for outside, you're not chayav for inside. What did Rabbi Shimon actually say in the Mishnah? He said, anything you are chayav outside, you're chayav inside. So clearly, he can't be referring to the case of malika. Either way, he can't be saying that you're chayav for malika outside, or he can't be saying you're patur for malika on the inside. So take away that case in the Mishnah. Let's go to the Sefer. Ella Asef. Let's go to the end of our Mishnah, which again is 5 lines, the last words on the 5th wide line. Ella Asefakot. What did the Sefer say? Hashochet of bifnim. You did shchita on a carbon of a bird inside the Beit HaMikdash. Now, you're not supposed to do shchita on a bird. You're supposed to do malika, right? But you did shochet of bifnim, and then you were maleh b'chutz, you're patur, says the Mishnah. But if you did the opposite and you were shachat b'chutz, v'hala b'chutz, you'd be chayav. Because shchita outside is the proper thing to do. And so you're chayav for the ha'ala, right? Again, you're chayav for the shchita too, but that's not the point. The point is, are you chayav for the ha'ala? If you did shchita inside and ha'ala outside, you're patur. If you did shchita outside and ha'ala outside, you're chayav. That's the Tanakam. And along comes Rabbi Shimon. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon, no. I don't like this disparity between inside and outside. Yehecha debifnim lo mechayav. Just like you're not chayav for doing it inside the Beit HaMikdash, because you can't do shchita inside. B'chutz nami lo mechayav. You shouldn't be chayav for doing shchita outside because it's supposed to be done inside with malika. Says Gemara, that could be true, but again, it doesn't fit the words of Rabbi Shimon. Because Rabbi Shimon said, anything you're chayav b'chutz, you should be chayav b'fnim. Hay kol she'ein chayav in mibayla. He should have said, if you're not chayav inside, you're not chayav outside. Ella, maybe, this is the 4th case and the last one, maybe what Rabbi Shimon is saying is, ki hecha de b'chutz mechayav, just like you're chayav outside the Beit HaMikdash for doing shchita of a bird and then halah, bifnim nami mechayev. If you do the same thing, a shchita inside, unlike the Tanakhama said you're patur, Rabbi Shimon saying you're chayev, right? But then again, that is fine, because then he says anything you're chayev outside, you're chayev inside. The problem is that Rabbi Shimon continued and said, except for one case, and that's this case. Ha-katani chutz min hashochet bifnim ha-maleh b'chutz. Rabbi Shimon excluded this case. It's a great explanation, but he says it's not true. So we have no understanding of Rabbi Shimon. Says the Gemara, well, the only thing we can do is we can add words to the Mishnah, right? Get creative. If you have trouble understanding the Mishnah, make another case. And basically, chasurim mechasra. We don't use that word. Some, I think, put the words in. What does the Bach say? No, he doesn't. But the difference, says the Gemara, you really have to add some words to our Mishnah. One of the words you have to add to our Mishnah is that there's another case, meaning not a bird and shchita and malika, which is a great case, but let's think of another thing that is puzzle inside the Beit HaMikdash and kosher outside the Beit HaMikdash. And what's that case? Says Zeiri, you know what the case is? Shchitat behima belayla ika b'nayim. Let's say you shecht an animal at night, right? So in the Beit HaMikdash, remember, you can't do shchita at night. All of the avodah has to be done during the day. If you shecht a carbon ola at night, it's possible. But if you shecht an animal outside the Beit HaMikdash at night, that's fine. There's no prohibition on shchita at night outside the Beit HaMikdash. Right? So let's say you shecht your ola outside the Beit HaMikdash at night, and then you put it on the Mizbeach, you're chayev. If you shecht it inside and you put it on the Mizbeach, you're patur. So that's a different case. So let's see how Rabbi Shimon addresses that case. So it says Zeiri, shchitat behima b'layla ika b'naya. Hachikamra. This is what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Well, before we get to Rabbi Shimon, add these words in the Mishnah, or imagine these words in the Mishnah. V'chein, and another case where there's a disparity between inside and outside, is hashochet behima bifnim balayla. Let's say you shecht the carbon ola inside the Beit HaMikdash at night, and then you take it outside and you burn it on a bama. V'hala b'chutz. Says the Mishnah, the words we're adding in our Mishnah, you'd be patur, because you don't shchita inside the Beit HaMikdash at night is possible. But if you're shachat b'chutz balayla, if you shecht it outside at night, that's fine.
How is that okay?
Outside?
Yeah, but it's shchita for a korban.
The halah is what you're chayav for. The shchita, you actually might not be chayav for the shchita because you can't do shchita, but you can do the halah. It's
But
always
still counts.
so shachat b'chutz balayla. That's a good question. If you shecht it outside at night, the halah b'chutz, you'd be chayav. So that's a case where inside the Beit HaMikdash you're patur because you can't do shchita at night. Outside the Beit HaMikdash you're kosher because you can do shchita at night. And along comes Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon then comes along to say, Rabbi Shimon Omer, no. Kol shechayavin alav b'chutz, chayavin al kiyotziu b'fnim. If you do it outside and you're chayav, then if you did the same thing inside, v'ha'ala b'chutz, you'd be chayav. So I disagree, and I say that this case, except for one exception, which is shochet ha'of b'fnim ha'ala b'chutz, but with the exception of shchitat ha'of, which is not this case, anything that if you did it outside, you'd be chayav, doing it inside and taking it outside, you're just as chayav. So that's how you understand the Mishnah. Rava says a very similar answer, but a different psul. What is the different psul? Rava Amar Kabbalat b'kli chol ikibeinayim. Let's say you shecht your animal and you accept all the blood in a pitcher. That's not a kli sharet. So remember, I told you, and I'm previewing tomorrow's Mishnah, you don't need a kli sharet in a bama, but you do need a kli sharet in the Beit HaMikdash. And so if you accept all of the blood in a Stanley cup, then it's like you have no blood. You have to throw it away, and then that's the carbon's puzzle because there's no blood. Outside, it's not a problem at all. So let's say you did that. You were shechted the animal. You accepted all of the blood b'kli chol. Hatana yachikam. This is how you read the Mishnah now. V'chein, add the new case. Hamikabel b'kli chol bifnim. You accept the blood of the shchita into a secular, we'll call it, a kli chol, not a kli sharet, and then the animal's puzzle because there's no blood to go on the mizbeach. If you're then ma'aleh b'chutz, you're patur because this animal was not kosher because there's no blood. But if you did the opposite outside, the same thing outside, I mean, hamikabel b'kli chol b'chutz v'hela b'chutz, you'd be chayav. So there's a difference between inside and outside. And along comes Rabbi Shimon to say, Rabbi Shimon Omer, no. Kol shechayavin alav b'chutz, chayavin al kiyotzi bo b'fnim v'helo b'chutz. Anything that if you did it outside, and then it's kosher outside, or it's not kosher, but you're chayav outside. If you do the equivalent thing inside, and then you take it outside, it's as if you did it outside and you're chayav. Chutz, for one exception, so let's read that, which is the bird. Chutz m'ashochet of bifnim ve'ala b'chutz. So that is the way you'd have to understand our Mishnah, is that our Mishnah is really talking about a third case, which you could see why this is such a dochik, right? Because our Mishnah says nothing about it. Instead of the birds and malika and shchita, there's a new case of another psul that applies inside and not outside, and that's where they argue. So that's the first answer of our Gemara. Says the Gemara now, 4 lines before the Mishnah, Hashta, 4 lines before the Mishnah. But Hashta, nowadays that we have the updated version of the Gemara, and we have the Braita, the Tani Avua Dishmo Bar Rav Yitzchak, we have this Braita that Avua Dishmo told us the name of Rav Yitzchak, which is, I'll quote it in a second. This all makes a lot more sense. Because what is the Braita that he came and told us? What about, this is now we're quoting a Braita, Malek of Gifnim. You do malika on a bird that's a carbon inside the Beit HaMikdash. Everything's right so far. Ve'ha'alo b'chutz, and you now take it outside and put it on the mizbeach, you're chayav for halat chutz. Okay? Everyone agrees with this. There's no debate. Continues the Braita, malak b'chutz, ve'ha'ala b'chutz, patur. But if you did that malika outside, then the second you did the malika, you passed the bird and you're not chayav for ha'ala. That's what our Mishnah said. But Rabbi Avua de Shmuel had a very interesting addition in his Braita. His Braita continued with the words, Rabbi Shimon mechayav. Wow. Rabbi Shimon actually says you're chayav for doing that. So for doing malika outside and halal outside, you are chayav, which our Mishnah did not say. But now that we have this version, it turns out that our Mishnah was probably a mistake. Because when our Mishnah said, anything you do outside, if you did it outside, you're chayav, you're doing it inside, you're chayav, was including this case in Rabbi Shimon. Remember, the problem we had with that in our Mishnah was that the next words in our Mishnah were, chutz, sorry.
That's an oath.
It's the opposite, because Rabbi Shimon is then saying anything that if you did it inside your chayav, right, and you're maleh b'chutz, if you do it outside your chayav. The problem is that in our Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon said anything you do outside your chayav, you're also chayav for inside. It turns out that's a mistake. So let's read that inside. Rabbi Shimon hatam kai. Rabbi Shimon's referring to that case where you did malika on a carbon outside the Beit HaMikdash. Vitniim, what you should say in Rabbi Shimon, you have to change the words in our Mishnah to say, Kol shechayavin alav bifnim, ha'ala b'chutz, chayavin alav b'chutz. Anything that's a chiyav inside, which is malika, basically, if you do it outside, you're also chayav. And so that is the way you have to understand our Mishnah. The case of Rabbi Shimon is saying you're also chayav for doing things outside that you would be chayav for doing inside. And so those are the two ways to understand our Mishnah. Either change Rabbi Shimon to, instead of be saying anything you're chayav outside, you're chayav inside, to be saying anything you're chayav inside, you're also chayav outside. Or add words in the Mishnah that Rabbi Shimon is talking about a third case. And that is, we're up to the Mishnah. We're going to stop here. And like I said, tomorrow's daf, I'm not doing it live, but I did record it and it is in the WhatsApp. If you need me to email it, please let me know. I started from this Mishnah, which will finish the 13th parak, and then the rest of tomorrow's daf, which is the bulk of tomorrow's daf, is all of the Mishnayot of the 14th parak. So it's a very lot. It's like 10 Mishnayot. I don't know how much it is in the Kahati, but in our Gemara, it just goes till Kuf Yud Gimel and Aleph. And God willing, it will take us to the last parak of the second Zevachim.
Oh,
Yasher Koach, everyone.
Yasher Koach.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Okay.
Safe travels.
Thank you.
Safe travel, safe skiing.
Thank you, Charlie.